Should you sell a company's stock if its CEO was exposed to prenatal pollution or childhood trauma? That sounds like a strange question, but it may have a very real answer. My guest today is here to help us unpack that. His name is Raghu. He is the Sir Evelyn de Rothschild Professor of Finance at Cambridge University, the founder and academic director of the Cambridge Center for Alternative Finance, and Gresham Professor of Business. So, Professor Raghu, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me, James. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, off the bat, if someone takes a look at your website, at your research, they can see that you have studied some unusual and interesting things, kind of off the main beaten path of finance. You've studied early life disasters and CEO behavior. You've studied name changes of companies, and you've studied EPA Superfund sites and their later effect via prenatal pollution exposure on the behavior of CEOs who were born in these areas. Why? Like, how did you get into this area? What draws you to these topics?
Okay, so I've actually, as you know, I've done research in a number of different areas. I've talked about companies, I've talked about individual people behavior, talked about mutual funds, everything. But I think the common part about all my research is they involve human beings. So in other words, I try to find out, why do individuals do quirky things? So usually what happens is I'll be reading a newspaper article or watching the news, and something will come out that the CEO did something or somebody did something, and I'm saying, why did they do that? I mean, that makes no sense whatsoever. So the paper on name changes, which you referred to a few minutes ago, that was sparked by actually a party at my house where I and my co-author, we were talking about the day's Wall Street Journal. That's a thing. Do not invite a finance professor to a party because, they don't talk to other people. They just talk about finance. But the article in the Wall Street Journal was basically mentioning these three companies which had changed their names to something with a .com at the end. This was the time of the .com bubble, and had a big jump in their stock price. And so we said, hold on a minute, that can't be true. I mean, nothing has changed about the company. It's the same company as it was the day before. So why did the price pop? So we went upstairs, my co-author Mike and I, we sat in front of the computer and we found 20 companies which had changed their name in the last few weeks or so. And then my wife got mad because, why are you wasting your time sitting in front of a computer when your guests are looking for you? So we do what every professor does, which is basically get a PhD student, sit him in front of the computer while Mike and I went out to have a beer. Of course, we gave the PhD student co-authorship on the paper. It wasn't that he was, non-compensated for it. But the whole point there was sometimes people behave irrationally, right? They see a new hot thing. So in this particular case, the .com bubble, but we saw subsequently the same thing happening with blockchains, with AI, with any sort of new technology that happened. And so people get fixated on this new technology and they're afraid of missing out. So they buy shares without even checking to make sure that this is actually going to be a change in the cash flows. So to give you an example, I mean, if you look at the newspapers today, pretty much every company and its dog will be talking about AI, how they're using AI, right? I mean, Taco Bell says that it's using AI. And like, why is Taco Bell using AI? I mean, what has AI got to do with it? Right? But these are the questions which I'm interested in. Why do people do weird things?
And if I recall correctly from that name change paper, you found no or little post-announcement drift, as they say in academia. Like, it was actually enduring, which is surprising, right?
That was surprising, but it lasted till the end of the .com bubble. I had a follow-up paper which said, what happened to the same companies after the bubble was over? And what we found was the same companies that added the .com to their name, got rid of the .com from their name, and they had another pop in price. So companies were basically following the latest trend. Whatever investors want, we give it to them, though we actually never change.
Packaging counts. Yeah, it reminds me of some of those situations of ticker confusion where people think they're buying one stock, and I'm forgetting some of the names now, but there have been some famous cases of this, and they buy the wrong one. It makes a huge economic impact.
Absolutely. I mean, my favorite example was Signal. When Elon Musk tweeted, use Signal in January last year, and everybody started buying shares of a company called Signal Advance. But Signal is a non-profit company. It does not have any shares out there. So what were they doing buying shares of a completely different technology? I have no idea.
It makes you question humanity sometimes, but I guess we get by in this world. You won something called an Ignoble Prize in 2017, or for some research you published in 2017, which let me see if I can make sure I got the full name of the paper. What doesn't kill you will only make you more risk-loving. Early life disasters and CEO behavior. The Ignoble Prize, for those who don't know, is sort of it's a quirky award given to research that's seen as quirky or weird or random or just very unusual in some way. I believe you claimed the award. How did you feel about that?
I actually was pretty thrilled, mainly because of the fact that, if you think, one of the quirks about the Ig Nobel is that it's meant given to research that makes you laugh when you first hear about it, but then makes you think about it. For example, there have only been two professors at the University of Cambridge who got the Ig Nobel Prize. One is myself, the other is a professor in mathematics called Ray Goldstein. And Ray got it, for example, for taking a human hair and, if he says, what is the length of the hair before it starts frizzing up under its own surface tension? And he called that the Rapunzel length, right? He came up with a mathematical formula for it. And the first time anyone hears about that, they're like, whoa, that's the weirdest piece of research I've heard of. But the whole point there was the Rapunzel length is actually used by Procter & Gamble, for example, for the doses in your shampoo bottle. If you say 30 doses, how do they know 30 doses? Too little shampoo won't clean your hair. Too much shampoo is a waste of money. The Rapunzel length tells you exactly how much of a dose to keep your hair straight. So,
It's fascinating, actually, yeah.
exactly, that's the idea. It's a research that you think, oh my God, that's so weird, but then hopefully makes you think more deeply that there is an underlying question.
So with regard to your research, which in some ways is almost like an extension or a predecessor, a prequel of behavioral finance, somebody might argue. And behavioral finance, by the way, is it's all the rage now, but 25, 30 years ago, it was not. They really had to fight to get behavioral finance accepted. And of course, now it's much more mainstream. But I would argue studying these early life or prenatal things is a precursor to that. Where does that go in the sense that, and I'm going to ask about the paper specifically in a minute, but like, I don't think you're telling someone to do anything, but if someone were to say, okay, what are the takeaways from this? Like, how should I behave differently? I mean, on one hand, we don't want to judge people in a prejudiced way, or you were exposed to something at an early age, therefore I'm going to blacklist you. But then it's a real thing. We don't want to ignore it. Therapists, for example, spend a lot of time unpacking traumas and issues that people got in early life, and that's reality. So,
Right.
like, what are the ultimate takeaways of some of this research?
Well, the difference between academic research and how practical it is essentially that we try to understand causality. Let me explain that slightly differently. The 2017 paper for which I got the Ig, was actually motivated by a different paper, very, very influential, by two professors, Professor Enrique Malmendier and Jeff Tate. And they, and another professor at Chicago, Stephen Nagel, they had actually come up with this idea of what we call depression babies. And so they looked at CEOs who were born during the Great Depression and compared them to CEOs who were not born during the Great Depression. And they found out that if you're born during the Great Depression, it has a big impact on the level of risk you're willing to take. You think debt is not a good thing. So when you become a CEO, you take much less debt than a similar CEO who's not been exposed to the Great Depression. Now, that was a nice piece of research, but when I read that paper, I was always thinking, hold on a minute, that's okay if you're poor, but what happens if your dad was a Rockefeller? I mean, what would the Great Depression really matter to you? But our problem was we can't actually go and call the CEO and say, how rich was your family during the Great Depression? I mean, they're not going to pick up the phone to answer a question like that. So we said, what publicly available data can you find to talk about the level of stress you dealt with when you were a baby? So in this particular case, the level of stress, we said, well, let's take natural disaster stress. So natural disasters are exogenous, they hit without warning, but some disasters are really bad and some disasters are okay, right? I mean, relatively okay. So to give you an example, Tim Cook in Apple, for example, was born in Mobile, Alabama. He went through his entire childhood, 30 tornadoes passed over Alabama, not a single one touchdown, nobody was hurt, nobody was injured. But in contrast, his predecessor, Steve Jobs, born in California, had a landslide near his house. 30 people were killed while he was growing up. So what we conjectured from that one is, when you're a baby, stress is stress. People are stressed out around you. People are worried about people dying and so on. So for you, if you have lots of disasters happen, but nothing bad ever happened to you or your family, you think, you know what? Risk is not a big deal. I can take care of it. I can handle it. And so relative to another CEO to whom something bad happened, you take much more risk than the second CEO. So that paper is published in the Journal of Finance. It got the Ignoble Prize. But the criticism of that paper was the parents know where the natural disasters are going to happen. So if you move to Alabama, you know you're going to get hit by tornadoes. So maybe there are genetic differences within the parents already. So how do you deal with that? So what we did in the current paper, the pollution paper, the Superfund paper, is what we're looking at is CEOs who were born before 1980. All except 2 of our sample were born before 1980. And 1980 is important because that's when the Superfund law was passed in America. Before that, nobody knew about pollution. Nobody cared much about pollution. The Love Canal disaster, all those things happened before 1980. So you were born in that area, you grew up in that area without ever realizing that you're being affected by pollution. Now, what can you do about it? Well, we are not saying that you should blacklist a CEO because they are being exposed to disasters. What we are saying is we tend to think of pollution as a small effect. It has direct health consequences on you, on your children, so on. What we are saying is this has big societal impacts. So when you become a CEO, you're affecting hundreds of people. You're firing hundreds of people, you're merging, you're taking over the company, you're affecting big sections of society. And this prenatal pollution, which you were not aware of, has an impact on your behavior even after 40 years. And so it's more a question of what's the social impact of pollution and why we should address pollution as opposed to how do we hire a CEO.
Interesting. I recall reading an article about some snowboarder a long time ago, some kid who was doing all these flips, and apparently he was adopted by a family, but his natural mother was a drug addict, and his therapist has theorized that somehow these drugs had affected his behavior and made him more apt to take these risks. So maybe one beneficiary of your research could be the CEOs themselves. They say, hey, I was born in this environment and here I am, and I'm statistically more likely to take certain risks. Maybe I should put some guardrails on and monitor my behavior. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, that's one possibility, but they don't, because most people don't typically, compare themselves to other people, right? They just think, and a typical CEO is pretty aggressive to start with, right? They're typically more, narcissistic in some way. They're more, trusting. They have a bigger personality.
They don't have a lot of self-doubt. I've never met a CEO with a lot of self-doubt.
Exactly. Yeah. And so how do you tell these guys that maybe this is too much? Rein yourself in. One question we were asked in this paper was, how do you become a CEO if you're taking all these risks? And by the way, the risks don't pay off.
Yep.
The difference is, in this big case, you're taking risks and the firm does worse. And not only does the firm does worse, but you get fired faster. So, it's bad for the CEO, it's bad for the firm, it's bad for everybody. So it's not that the risks are good risks. You're not measuring the risk, you're overestimating the benefits. But how do they become CEOs? In our results, we found that internal candidates get promoted. So in other words, it's not, you haven't been tested in the outside world. You haven't been vetted the same way as you would be if you're an outsider. You're an insider who's been promoted from within, and no one's ever seen how you're taking risks independently of everybody else. So you are relatively untested as a CEO, and you become the CEO at that point.
Interesting. So you're promoted basically by an internal system that probably overweights tenure and loyalty and might underweight your absolute competency.
Absolutely right. Exactly. That's what we conjecture in the paper. We don't have any proof, but that's what we conjecture.
And how are you defining risk? If someone asks, like, for example, debt relative to optimal debt for capital structure?
Correct. So we look at debt, we look at equity, we look at all the acquisitions they do for the other activities. For example, in debt, we find they take more debt, they pay a higher interest rate on the debt has a lower credit quality, the firm is more likely to likely to have a lower credit rating, In terms of equity, the firms have higher volatility, both systematic volatility, idiosyncratic volatility. They have a higher crash risk. They have a higher down to up ratio. They're more likely to make unrelated acquisitions, and the announcement period returns to those acquisitions is also worse. So across the board, it doesn't matter what it is. It looks like the risk is higher for both debt and equity, and the performance is worse. It shows up in the operating
Wow.
performance and the stock price performance.
And what is the sample size of companies?
About 3,000 companies, so after
Okay.
which 20% are, Superfund CEOs. So you're looking at about 600 CEOs like that.
20% is a high number, actually. Have you heard of investors using this research? Like if I'm a quant fund or some hedge fund, maybe I'm screening for this now that I realize I might have riskier stocks than I thought.
Yes, I mean the point is it's a lot of data to collect. We have to collect by hand because there is no database which
Yeah.
does. So it's a lot of, I guess, due diligence work which you have to do, right? And in many cases, people are a little skeptical of this. They'll say, "Oh, you know what? This guy was exposed to it before he was born, but this is 40 years later. How do we establish causality?" In our paper, we do that by only comparing two CEOs, one with Superfund exposure, the other one without. We're not comparing them to the general population. So
Yep.
in these two groups, we can sort of show causality. But it's difficult to convince, I guess, a board that this would be important. I mean, somebody would argue, hey, come on, 40 years, right? I mean, there's no causality here. So,
Yeah, you could argue there's a lot of idiosyncratic reasons why this might not apply to me, and maybe sometimes they're true, but it sounds like statistically overall they're not.
exactly right. Exactly
Yeah.
right.
If you had a magic wand and could change research, let's say, or maybe just predict, how would you like to see research 5 years, 10 years out? Like, what are the next steps from this? And maybe you're planning some of this research yourself.
Well, what I would like to see, and you mentioned that behavioral finance has become very mainstream now, but the missing part of behavioral finance is all about the fact that we don't really know, we have a theory. In other words, we have stories about optimism, we have stories about, overconfidence, we have stories about self-attribution biases and so on, but we don't know how these things are caused and which bias is playing a role in your behavior right now.
Hmm.
So, what I would like to do, or I think is important to do, is to link our actual behavior with biological things which you can measure. So, and that's what we are trying to do in our paper here. We are if you look at the paper, we have almost something like 40 or 50 citations to the medical literature linking pollution with adolescent behavior, for example, risk taking, crime, things like that. So I think economics needs to have, if you want to do something in behavioral finance, you need to establish at the end that it's not just a story you're telling. There is a biological basis for this, and I'd like to see some of that. The other area is the fact that, especially important today, is that we're all affected by other people. But economics sort of makes this assumption that we're individual rational players, right? So I'm not affected by your behavior, you're not affected by my behavior, so you can model how this works. But I'm thinking social finance is actually very, very, very important topic. That means how does my behavior change when I realize that all my friends are doing one thing? Even if I think that's irrational, I choose to do it because my friends are doing it. Right? One example might be buying a Bored Ape NFT. Right? Some of us would say, wait, what are you paying so much money for it? But I'm part of a club now. I can hang
Yep.
out with these guys. So there's a social aspect.
You're very strong intangible benefits, which as a human being, those are powerful motivators.
Exactly right. Exactly.
Yeah, economics is a social science underneath. And in the beginning, it was treated as a mathematical science, I guess, for algebraic convenience, but we're increasingly finding out it's actually quite far from that.
Unfortunately, you're absolutely right. Life was easy when we thought we could model human beings with mathematics, but human beings are way more complex than that.
The paper I should mention is Hazed and Confused Prenatal Pollutant Exposure and CEO Risk Taking. Raghu, if somebody watching this says, this is not enough, Raghu, well, I want more, where can they go to learn more about you and your research?
Well, all my papers are published on ssrn.com, so the Social Science Research Network. That's actually a good go-to site for literally any kind of social sciences research. You can type in behavioral finance, you can type in all these things. The only problem, of course, is because everybody uses this, you have a very low signal to noise ratio. There's a lot of noise in the,
Yeah.
so that's a downside. But I guess one way would be to look for papers that are heavily cited by other authors, right? And uh, that's one of the best ways to figure out which is a good piece of research or a bad piece of research. It's an interesting field now. It's changing by
Yep.
the day, right? And so
Yep. And if somebody wants more of your research directly, they can just go to your website
my
or
website
search
will have
your name in Cambridge, and we can put it under the show notes as well.
yes, exactly. Thank
Excellent.
you.
Yeah, it's my pleasure, and thank you very much for joining us. Certainly, if I ever host a party when you're in Washington D.C., happy to have you over. We can go upstairs and escape the party and play on the computer a little bit. Sounds like that's your modus operandi. Raghu, thank you very much for joining us. You've been generous with your time, and thanks to you guys as always for watching at home.
Thank you very much, James. It's a pleasure talking to you.